So we just talked about this software requirement which we created, and we actually linked it to one software test. Now I want to show you how a framework can actually auto-generate a lot of your documentation, for example, traceability matrices, based on this software requirement we just looked at. So for that, we might actually have to link that software requirement to a few more tests just to make this interesting. So we get the software requirement data saved to database, and it's tested by software test 3. So let's maybe just edit it and add another software test. I don't know, test the diagnosis feature. All right, so now the software requirement is actually tested by 2 software tests. One regulatory requirement would be that you have traceability between your software requirements and your software tests. How would you show that? Well, in the EU, in my experience, it's typically enough just to show, well, each software requirement has these software tests with these IDs. For FDA compliance, however, what I've always seen is traceability matrices. So you need to create a table in which you show which software requirement is tested by which software test. How does that look? Well, the good news is Formwork actually can automatically generate all of that stuff for you, literally everything I just mentioned. So we go to Audit Export, and then Formwork generates all this data we just talked about. Now you can see, let's just scroll down to certain things. So it creates a gigantic bunch of traceability matrices. And I won't go into all of these in detail, but I think the only interesting one for our purposes today is the software requirements to software tests traceability matrix. So you can see, well, we just now created software requirement 17, and it was covered by 2 software tests, software test 1 and software test 3. And that's exactly what we see in this table. So Formwork automatically generates that, which in my opinion is really, really cool. So you have other traceability matrices, for example, stakeholder requirements to software requirements, and the general principle is always the same, except that we haven't talked about stakeholder requirements yet. At the bottom, Formwork also outputs just all the descriptions of all requirements. So probably we'll be finding our software requirement somewhere here. You can see software requirement 17. You can actually see, oh great, here we have software requirement 17. It would actually output the description here if we had entered one, and it shows us, well, which software tests are covering this. So all of this can be exported as a PDF, and you can just hand it in as your technical documentation, which in my opinion is extremely elegant. One thing which we actually noticed earlier was that Formwork can keep track of which requirements were changed. So the even neater thing here is that for subsequent releases, and this is a subsequent release because it's version 2 and we already looked at version 1 of the software earlier, it actually automatically outputs also which requirements were changed. So you don't even need a human to tell you, well, in this release we changed this requirement as well. So you don't need to do that. Instead, you just let Formwork do it, and Formwork actually automatically answers this question for you. What changed in this release? So it tells you, oh look, you added a bunch of stakeholders. We added these 3 stakeholders for some reason. And let's actually look at the software requirement we added just now. So it says okay, software requirements are here, and here's software requirement 17. That's actually the one we added earlier. So this is really great. So Formwork really just does a diff. So it does this, it compares the old version to the new version, and then it tells you what changed. Of course, it also tells you about modified and deleted things. We don't have deleted things here right now, but the software requirement 1 and 2, for example, they were modified. So Formwork detects that. So that's the audit export, and I think that's really super, super exciting. Now, if you take the step even further, which I think is really, really an interesting thought, is if already Formwork can go through your documentation and check some of this, why can't it check it even more and make us consultants finally unemployed? Now, that's already something we built. So if you go to Sanity check, it already gives you something like a very, very simple, cheap consultant, or one of those consultants out there who don't understand software and just check your documentation for structure, which I've heard these consultants exist. Now, if you go to Sanity check, this is this not technically proficient consultant, right? So it just tells you, oh yeah, all these descriptions are blank, and but it actually goes into more detail. So it doesn't just tell you, look, for software requirement 4, the description is blank. It also tells you, look, software requirement 4 should actually have software tests because it's a regulatory requirement that each software requirement is tested in some way. And of course, all the other relations are also checked. So each software requirement will need to relate to a stakeholder requirement. And this is also checked here. So it tells you like, it's not related to a stakeholder requirement, so that's missing. And all of this other stuff. So this is really, really cool. Like this gives you a quick overview of how complete is my documentation actually. And that's just so great, because if I review documentation as a human and you pay me for that, then a lot of the stuff I find is sometimes like this. It's like, okay, dude, like please, why don't your software tests cover your requirements? And in this case, Formwork just does that. And you don't even have to pay Formwork additionally for doing this review. All right, so let's call them fancy features, where you have, automatic generation of traceability matrices and other documents, and you have sanity checking, well, what I call the cheap consultant. And in the final video, we'll be looking at the risk management, which in my opinion is the highlight of Formwork, and for some reason, it ends up being the last video.